I'm going to ask each of the next two panellists to give us about 10 or 15 minutes in opening remarks, and then we'll go into a panel discussion and a question and answer session. So perhaps Leanne, if you could kick off first. Yeah.
Hello, good morning everyone. My name is Doody and I lead Smart Cities work for Arup. We're a global multidisciplinary consultancy specialising in built environment. And my work over the last 14 years has involved giving policy and advice to cities and governments around the world, but also advising on large master plans in terms of how they can use technology to better deliver the things that they want to deliver in those places. And this morning I'm going to talk about this complex relationship between, an evolving relationship between online and place, and how digital is affecting place and vice versa. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what cities are doing about that at the moment and how developers are trying to tackle that, and sort of leave you with some food for thought for the discussion. So in terms of how we experience place now, I think, Governor O'Malley mentioned it, the smartphone has really changed how we navigate space. So I don't know about you, but I make extensive use of Google Maps in trying to get around Dublin. I've just returned to Dublin after 16 years in London, and there's a lot of new places like around here that I just don't know at all. So I think how we experience place and how we navigate is starting to change. And I think one example of that is retail. So if we look at how the retail landscape has changed in the last sort of 15 years, so much has gone to online. So I think in Ireland we now spend €7.5 billion annually on online, and that is going to increase by 25%. And we see the impact of that on high streets. So all over the world, cities are struggling with what do they do with the high streets that they had, which have been impacted greatly by out-of-town retail, but now online retail. And what are the things, the things that are migrating online, like, obviously selling books and selling clothes and selling those kinds of things, but even things like insurance brokers, travel agents, all these things migrating online. What do we do with the spaces that are left over? How do we deal with the impact in terms of business rates or lack of? And then how do we, the other thing that's although the commerce is migrating online, the offline effects in terms of impact on transport systems and logistics systems is very real. So in London, I think in the last 3 years, the number of white vans or light goods vehicles has increased by 11%. And that is solely due to online retail. And that's causing, that increase is causing massive problems in terms of congestion. So I think we've got an interesting impacts here in terms of what's happening online, affecting what's happening offline rather, in the real world, and the sort of rebound effects of that, and how things are having to change. So in terms of development, we see a much greater impact or emphasis on experience in terms of creating places, placemaking, because the offline, the real world has to deliver something different now. If you look at changing work patterns, the growing shift towards knowledge work, we can do a lot of that work at home. And in fact, sometimes it's more effective and efficient to actually work at home if you have something to do. So workers are then demanding different things of the office space and the places where those office spaces are located, in terms of greater opportunities to collaborate, greater opportunities to work together, to meet different people, to have new experiences. And that affects not only the building, but also the places, the new developments, and we work on a lot of these types of developments, where those things are situated, the spaces between the buildings. How do we enable those experiences? And again, some of those experiences will be delivered through digital means. So I think in terms of, I think the other thing to remember is that these things take a while to feed through. If we think Amazon, I looked this up this morning, Amazon was founded in 1994, which is actually over 20 years ago. But the impacts have been feeding through, and in a way, retail is the sort of canary in the coal mine in terms of how online and how digital is affecting spaces. I think a more recent example is Airbnb and Uber. You know, these digital platforms which claim to be only digital, but actually have huge impacts in terms of land use, in terms of labour markets, in terms of the sort of jobs and investment landscape. So Airbnb is a very interesting one because it's causing it's a great, like Uber, a great offer to consumers. It's something that people want. Both in terms of the people who stay and the people who rent out the properties. But it has these wide system effects which were not necessarily recognised at the beginning. So in Dublin, I know there's a huge issue with it in other cities as well, in terms of its impact on housing stock, its impact on availability of housing, social impacts in terms of neighbours, impact on sort of the neighbourhood, you know, and on all the social and political impacts that come with that. On the other hand, it does enhance, potentially enhances the tourism offer. So, you know, there is a balance, and I think that's the side that London came down on when they started looking at Airbnb. But they may need to revisit that. And I think the response also needs to be differentiated, because if you look in rural areas, in the village, my husband is from West Cork, and the village that he comes from, Airbnb is actually revitalising the economy of that village. In that there were a lot of vacant properties in the village, which people don't really want to live in anymore because they can get something, you know, the similar price, lots more space, slightly outside the village, and these properties are generally quite small and cramped. But now they're being let out as Airbnb properties, and now there are, you know, all year round cafes, and there's the pub, so there's a lot more economic activity, all year round economic activity in that village without having to build anything, without having to build a hotel or keep that hotel going. So I think we need a differentiated response to those things. But again, it illustrates how these digital platforms have massive systemic effects in terms of space, in terms of land use, in terms of labour markets, in terms of economics and social and political. A new technology, which will be upon us, well, depending on who you believe, in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, automated vehicles. And automated vehicles are clearly, I mean, I think everyone recognises, have the potential to be hugely disruptive. In the same way that the original motor vehicle has had a massive effect on how we live and work and the spatial distribution of our cities and towns and settlements. So, you know, automated vehicles, there are very many different predictions, but I think there is a consensus that in 50 years we will have automated vehicles somehow. You know, the prediction that I read recently, Morgan Stanley says by 2026, 100% of all vehicles sold will be automated vehicles. And then another researcher says that's 2035. But anyway, so the trend is definitely towards automated vehicles. But how do we make allowances for those automated vehicles? I mean, there's a lot of discussion around labour markets and the impact of automation on labour markets, although we don't know what the answer is yet. But there's also a big impact spatially. So, you know, the same towns and spatial layouts that we have now will very likely be the same in 50 years' time. How do we adapt those to handle automated vehicles? How do we, will we need car parks? This is something that developers are asking us now, you know, so when they're looking at, you know, long period, 5 to 10 year type programs, they're saying, well, you know, are we going to need, you know, this amount of car parking space if we're going to have automated vehicles? You know, things like adapting the bays. So there's a whole load of spatial questions, never mind the sort of ethical and social and political questions around that. So what are cities doing about this? Those are just some examples, but cities are, as Governor O'Malley mentioned, cities are very aware of the potential for digital technology to enable them to deliver better services, but also to communicate better with citizens. We recently did a study of 20 different smart city strategies for 20 cities around the world. And we found that, in the last 5 years, there's been an acceleration in terms of cities actually producing smart city strategies. So they do have them. They're mostly around, they're looking at economic, they're looking at how to attract investment, how to attract jobs, how to deliver infrastructure. They're looking at social issues, so they're very much looking at the issues that you raised around communication and democracy and enabling citizens to engage in problem solving. And they're also looking at environment issues and climate change. In particular, we're doing some work with London, with the Greater London Authority at the moment, where they're looking at setting up a London Office of Technology and Innovation, which is looking at how do we collaborate better across different political boundaries, because this is often an issue that there are different political boundaries that need to be worked across. How do we deliver services better? How do we do the basics well? And then how do we use our capital programs such as TfL, all the data that's coming out of TfL, to deliver better services in the boroughs? And I think that's really the kinds of issues that cities are looking at all over the world. And I think just, to finish off, I think the key thing really is to be clear about the objectives. And so I think whether you're a private developer, public sector developer, whether you're building new things or looking at existing things, trying to be clear about what the objectives are, trying to be clear about what technology you already have. And I think, again, speaking to your point, this is not trivial. I think often cities don't necessarily know, certainly the state of the infrastructure, not even the data sets they hold or the riches that they hold potentially. And then to understand what your ambition is. So what is it that you want to do, and how can technology help you to get there? So I'm looking forward to a good discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Leanne. And who would have known when Airbnb burst on the scene that it would have such radical implications for smaller and rural areas? So a lot of food for thought in that. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Edward Jones from Dixon Jones, an experienced and award-winning architect who has worked in universities right across Europe and North America, and has been recognised both with the Fellowship of the Royal Institute of Architects here in Ireland and also with the CBE in 2011 in the UK. Professor Jones, if I could ask you to come to the podium.
Good morning. Delighted to be here. Also to be in Kevin Roach's building, in that I worked with Kevin Roach in Detroit in 1961. So this is a sort of strange moment for me of finally coming to see Kevin in his building. Now, how to begin? First to say that Rachel Chidlow is here in the second row. With Rachel and her husband, Paul Keogh, we won a bid to transform College Green. And so rather than talking about the world of computers, I'm going to talk about the world of reality, about a project that is here in Dublin. So to be rather physical and straightforward, I hope. First two slides I have represent the great initiative of object making that has characterized most of 20th century cities to the detriment of the public realm. So this is Corbusier, 1927, promoting a city of towers on Paris, which was seen as very influential. And the next slide is much more ancient. It's dealing with Nolli's plan of Rome, where the public realm is described as being within buildings, that's the Pantheon, and the space outside, so that you have a sort of extended pattern of public life that the first slide clearly doesn't contribute to. And so here we are in Dublin. This is the plan we were given when we began the competition, Rachel, 2016, little over a year ago, with this rather amorphous shape around Foster Place South and the space in front of Trinity and the Bank of Ireland. Rather like a sort of fried egg, a sort of amorphous shape with the Bank of Ireland as its hypothetical yoke. And so we didn't find this a very compelling starting point. We looked back in history, back to the 15th century, to discover College Green being this rather interesting wedge shape prior to the the making of the Parliament building on that square 12 on this map. Trinity was well established. So what you have in an interesting way was that Dublin had a place of public appearance, and that was removed. And one might say that places of celebration and protest were not available in Dublin. Partly, this is College Green as College Green. It's very green. And this is the meadow immediately outside Trinity. And more images here of showing the development of College Green as a place of public appearance, a place that citizens would come, and one assumes that citizens could celebrate and protest in this space. But Dublin, after the Act of Union, had no such place. And there was no Trafalgar Square, there was no Place de la Concorde, where there could be big national occasions like this. I mean, this was College Green. This is President Obama speaking to the Irish people. And notwithstanding trees and obstacles, a very large crowd congregated in College Green. And also the requirement for Patrick's Day celebrations, a place of procession, a place of congregation. So I have two digressions which take me to my own city in London, which I thought were interesting when we were doing the competition. We were involved with Somerset House, which is London's first office building, a place where Nelson got his instructions for Trafalgar. So the Admiralty was here. A wonderful place, very handsome building by Chambers, but used by the civil servants as a kind of parking lot, which was mildly scandalous. And through the initiative of the Somerset House Trust, the cars were taken out, and we were able to celebrate this wonderful place. This is a sort of rather architectural drawing which shows Waterloo Bridge, and we made a small connection here to introduce the South Terrace as a public place, and then to move through this wonderful courtyard to the Inns of Court and the London School of Economics to the north. So that became a sort of series of connections. Also, this was interesting from our point of view to think about College Green as a place of possible connections. So Somerset House then had its fountains, it had its skating rink, it had its fashion shows. So a skating rink could be established there. And this raises, for me, the interesting thought that a public place might offer a whole series of possibilities, but essentially based on the fact that these fountains can be switched off. And in Trafalgar Square, you have these enormous Lutyens fountains, which anesthetize the territory. You can only have the fountains. So in this case, the fountains are reversed, and in the winter you can have ice skating, or you can have a summer day and sit about and drink coffee. Or you can have enormous theatrical presentations, movies, like 2,000 people watch the movies. Now, this starts to be a kind of brief to ourselves about the possibility of College Green. The other one is the procession, and this is a job we did in London for Exhibition Road to form a route from South Kensington Tube Station, for those that know London, and then a promenade that goes 600 metres up to Hyde Park, with all the big institutions acquiring entrances off this new route, given that Cromwell Road has turned into a semi-urban motorway going out west to Heathrow. So this starts to produce a new kind of place that previously was a very second-rate street, again dominated by car parking. I mean, this doesn't show it quite as sort of critically difficult, but it basically was a very long car park. So what we've done here is produce a thing called a single surface where people, bicycles, and cars coexist. And this, in a sense, is not a new idea. You might say that every Italian city of the sort of 16th century has this condition where cars and people coexist. And the diagonal pattern establishes a way in which the institutions on either side can be drawn together. Nighttime, new lighting, paving, and before returning to College Green, thoughts about trapezoidal spaces, because in College Green we've got a wedge-shaped space. So Piazza de España, sorry, we've gone whizzing forward, here in Rome, trapezoidal space, Place Dauphine in Paris, another trapezoidal space. And then in the USA, on Roosevelt's memorial by Louis Kahn, with fine linden trees and a broad flight of steps. I found this very moving place. It looks towards the to the UN building on the East River. So back to Dublin, and a point one might make about College Green, which is here, this is all very well known to you, Parnell Square, O'Connell Street, College Green, Grafton Street, and St. Stephen's Green is square street, square street, square, as an extraordinary kind of set of connections that the master plan for Dublin has been progressively putting in place. And we were fortunate enough to be invited to look at, I think, a rather critical moment in that sequence for College Green. Not to really go into this in great detail, but what we're talking about here is maintaining the buses that can come up and turn around and go back again. This is Dame Street. And that the area between, what's the name of this, Church Lane and Foster Place South, this then becomes predominantly a pedestrian area with a dedicated bicycle route down its south side. Then the Lewis is crossing to the east here, which is about to be installed. Yeah, it's about to happen. So these are renderings that we did, and we've taken trees out of the center here so that you can have congregations, and move trees then to the south edge and trees either side of this funneled approach from to Dame Street. I think it's a very simple diagram. I mean, these were sketches one made at the time of the competition, showing in slightly Somerset House mode that you could have fountains, you could have a very large crowd, you could have ice skating, and you could have concerts and movies. So this becomes a very public and celebrated place. So these images sort of show where we've got to, fine materials, and respecting the existing statues of Grattan and his relationship to Oliver Goldsmith and Burke, at Trinity, and then moving Davis from where he is presently to the centre of this rond-point, looking then west into Ireland rather than looking over the shoulder of Grattan to Trinity. So we think that's something we want to definitely get to happen. And these are some of the images showing it clear of the buses, clear of the sort of urban sort of confusion that exists there presently. And that's looking from Trinity, seating, London plane trees, certain big planters to protect citizens from the abuse of people driving very large trucks into them. And Jeremy Corbyn seems to find himself here. I don't know what he's doing there, but he thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. And I suppose in Dublin Chamber, we're very much focused on what makes a city work, and not just Dublin, but all the cities in the country. And very much we understand that that social inclusion is hugely important for economic vibrancy and quality of life, and that successful cities in the future will be the ones that manage to embrace urban living, but very much engage in the public realm. Because we know, even though everybody is always on, and certainly with a house full of teenagers, it doesn't always seem like they're interacting, but we know that the basic human need for belonging and gathering is the same as it ever was. And so it's really interesting to see how the public space in cities can be developed in this digital age, but also how metrics, and very much, Governor, when you were mentioning about all the metrics, that we can almost measure human misery and human happiness and develop metrics to move those on the dials that we want for our future cities.